The lightning came out of nowhere, and for 4 seconds, Airlumen Flight 812 flew on nothing but luck. 39,000 feet over the mid-Atlantic, the Boeing 787-9 bucked once hard, and then the cabin lights died. Not flickered, died. In the cockpit, Captain Owen Petrakis felt the yoke go stiff under his hands as the primary flight computers rebooted themselves into confusion. First Officer Mara Bloom's voice cracked over the interphone. "We've lost autopilot. We've lost." Owen, the transponder's not responding. "We're squawking nothing." Somewhere behind them, a strike of static ate the radio hole. In seat 8A, a woman with graying auburn hair pulled back tight slept through the first jolt entirely. She did not wake for the second. It was the third, a hard yaw that sent a drink cart crashing into a bulkhead. That opened her eyes, calm and immediate, the way a person wakes who has been trained for years to come out of sleep already thinking. 2 rows back, a flight attendant named Jolene Ruiz gripped a seat back, her voice pitched to carry over the screaming turbulence. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We are working with the flight deck." Then the intercom crackled, Captain Petrakis' voice tight with something passengers rarely hear from a cockpit, restrained over fear. "Is there anyone on this aircraft with military flight experience? Anyone with combat aviation background? Please identify yourself to a crew member immediately." The woman in 8A unbuckled her belt. If you've ever wondered what it looks like when the quietest person in the room turns out to be the only one who knows exactly what to do, stay with this one to the end, because it only gets more impossible from here. And if stories like this pull something loose in your chest, consider subscribing. There are more like her waiting. Her name was Rhea Calder. Nobody on that plane knew it yet. They were about to. Rhea Calder was 47 years old, and for 22 of those years, the sky had not been a place she visited. It had been a place she owned. She'd flown 10 Thunderbolts low over places she didn't talk about at dinner parties, then transitioned into F-15 E-Strike Eagles for 2 combat deployments that had earned her a chest full of ribbons she kept in a drawer, not on a wall. Her call sign, given to her in flight school after she'd outflown 4 men in a training dogfight and left them furious, was Widow. Nobody used it anymore. She'd retired 18 months ago at the rank of colonel and now taught flight simulation to nervous airline cadets 3 days a week in a windowless building outside Denver. She was flying to Lisbon for her daughter's wedding. That was the whole plan. Sit quietly, drink bad airline coffee, cry a little during the vows, go home. Up front, First Officer Mara Bloom was 29 and exceptionally good at her job. On paper. She trusted the automation the way her generation had been trained to, implicitly, reflexively, the way older pilots trusted instinct. 20 minutes before the storm hit, she'd waved off a weather deviation Captain Petrakis suggested. "The system's already routing us around it," she'd said. "We're fine." The system had been wrong. The supercell had shifted north 40 miles in 11 minutes, faster than any forecast model predicted, and Flight 812 had flown straight into the heart of it. Rhea had felt the first pressure change in her sleep before her conscious mind caught up. Old pilots' bodies remember things their minds have tried to retire. 20 minutes earlier, everything had been ordinary. Captain Petrakis, 54, silver-templed and 30 years into a career that had taken him from regional turboprops to wide-body jets, had radioed ahead for a routine altitude check. Airlumen 812, requesting flight level 410 for smoother air. The reply had come back garbled, half swallowed by static. He'd frowned at it and let it go. Radios did that sometimes over open ocean. Mara had been watching the weather radar sweep lazily across her screen, a green blob of moisture 200 miles south that the system rated as low threat. "Nothing to worry about down there," she said, more to reassure herself than him. Petrakis had flown enough storms to distrust systems that spoke in absolutes. "Low threat can still eat a wing, Mara." She'd laughed it off. He hadn't. Behind the cockpit door, cabin life moved at its own gentle rhythm. Jolene Ruiz pouring coffee, a toddler 2 rows from the galley refusing to nap, a businessman reviewing slides for a Lisbon merger he'd rehearsed 40 times. Rhea Calder sat with her tray table down, a paperback open, unread. At 39,000 feet, the outside air temperature had begun dropping in a way the onboard computer logged but did not flag. A cell that had been building invisibly beneath a deceptively calm cloud deck was drawing energy up from the ocean surface at a rate meteorologists would later call, with clinical understatement, atypical. Nobody on Flight 812 knew it yet, but something was coming that no algorithm had modeled, and the woman built to handle it was 17 rows back, asleep. The first sign was subtle, a faint blue static crawl along the windshield, visible only in the dim of dusk settling over the ocean. St. Elmo's fire, Petrakis murmured, unbothered. He'd seen it 100 times. Mara nodded, eyes flicking between her displays. The weather radar still showed green, still low threat, still, according to every system on the flight deck, nothing worth changing course for. Then the ride roughened, not violently, just enough that the seatbelt sign chimed on and Jolene Ruiz moved briskly down the aisle, checking trays, murmuring reassurance in 3 languages. In row 8, Rhea felt the aircraft's rhythm change under her before she consciously registered why. 2 decades of low-level combat flying had rewired something primal in her. She didn't think about turbulence the way passengers did. She felt it the way a sailor feels a swell before it breaks. She closed her paperback. On the flight deck, a soft chime sounded, a routine system status update. Mara glanced at it, then dismissed it. Minor sensor variance, nothing flagged. Petrakis wasn't so sure. Let's request a deviation anyway. 10 degrees south. Mara hesitated, one hand hovering near the radio. The model says we clear it in 6 minutes if we hold course. The model isn't looking out the windshield, Petrakis said, his voice sharpening for the first time that flight. Outside, the cloud wall ahead had gone from gray to a deep, bruised charcoal, lit from within by flickers that weren't lightning yet, but would be within 90 seconds in a way that would change everything about this flight. The deviation request went out at 6:47 p.m. local time. The reply never fully arrived. Static swallowed half of it. Illuminate 12, cleared to deviate, and then nothing. Petrakis banked the aircraft south anyway, trusting the fragment of clearance he'd caught, easing the nose away from the blackest part of the cloud wall. It wasn't enough. The storm had grown faster than any deviation could outrun. The 787 hit the outer wall of the cell like driving from pavement on a gravel, a shuddering, grinding vibration that rattled coffee cups and sent one unsecured laptop skittering into an aisle. Mara's hands tightened on nothing, since the autopilot was still flying, still trusting its own calculations. Airspeed's fluctuating, she said, voice climbing half an octave. That's not right. That a 15-knot swing in 3 seconds. Petrakis's eyes moved fast across his instruments. Disconnect the autopilot. Hand fly it. The system's compensating. Mara, disconnect it. Now. She did, a half-second later than she should have, and the yoke came alive in Petrakis's hand with a violence that told him, instantly, this storm did not care what any model had predicted. In the cabin, the toddler near the galley began to cry. The businessman's laptop slides scattered across the floor, forgotten. Jolene Ruiz gripped a seat back and began, calmly and firmly, the practice litany. Please remain seated with your belts fastened. In 8A, Rhea Calder had already fastened hers. She was watching the wing outside her window flex in a way most passengers never notice pilots noticing. At 6:49, the second lightning strike hit the nose radome directly. The interior lights didn't flicker this time. They went out completely, plunging the cabin into a half-second of total darkness before the emergency strip lighting kicked in, dim and blue and wrong. Somewhere in the electronics bay, beneath the cockpit floor, 2 flight control computers rebooted simultaneously, a failure mode so statistically rare that engineers rated its likelihood at less than 1 in 10 million flights. Flight 812 had drawn that number. We've lost primary FMS, Mara said, and her voice had gone thin, almost childlike. Autopilot's not just off, it's gone. I've got amber flags across the whole panel. Petrakis felt the yoke go heavier, the hydraulics shifting to a backup mode that made every input feel like wrestling instead of flying. "I've got the aircraft. Give me transponder status." "Transponders, it's not transmitting. We're squawking nothing. Radar's showing us as an unidentified return, if it's showing us at all." Petrakis's jaw tightened. Over open ocean, that was a problem. Near a coastline patrolled by military radar, it could become something far worse. He keyed the radio. "Any station, this is Aerolumen 812, declaring an emergency, electrical and navigation systems degraded, requesting." Silence answered him. Not static. Silence. The specific dead silence of a radio that was transmitting into a void no one could hear. In row 8, Rhea Calder rose from her seat, steady on her feet despite the shuddering floor, and began walking calmly toward the front of the aircraft. By the time Rhea reached the forward galley, the aircraft had dropped 400 feet in altitude without anyone commanding it to. Jolene Ruiz caught her arm gently. "Ma'am, you need to be seated. I heard the captain's call," Rhea said, quiet even. "I flew combat aircraft for 22 years. Tell him." Something in the woman's voice, its total absence of panic, made Jolene release her arm instead of arguing. She rapped twice on the cockpit door, leaned close to the intercom. "Captain, I have a passenger. Says she's former military air crew. She's asking to come in." Petrakis, fighting a control yoke that no longer trusted its own hydraulics, didn't hesitate. "Let her in." The door opened. Rhea stepped into a cockpit lit only by emergency amber. Two pilots white-knuckled and sweating, alarms chiming in a rhythm that would have unsteadied most passengers permanently. She read the panel in under 3 seconds the way a fluent speaker reads a sentence. "Electrical bus failure, backup hydraulics engaged. No transponder, no reliable comm," she said. Not question. A summary. "Who are you?" Mara asked, half panicked, half hopeful. "Colonel Rhea Calder, retired. 22 years, fighters. Strike Eagles, mostly." She said it the way other people mention their old job in retail. "Captain, what's your airspeed trend?" "Unstable. 15 knots swings. Pitch for stability. Ignore the swings. There's sensor noise from the strike, not real." She said it with the flat certainty of someone who had said similar things over a headset while people shot at her. "You're flying it fine. You just don't believe it yet." Outside the windshield, far to their left, 2 pinpricks of light had begun closing distance fast. The pinpricks of light resolved, within 90 seconds, into 2 fighter jets holding tight formation off the 787's left wing. Mara saw them first and made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Owen, we've got aircraft. Fust move us. Right off our wing." Petrakis's stomach dropped. An unidentified aircraft, transponder dark, radios dead, drifting off its filed course near a NATO training corridor that ran along this stretch of ocean. Every instinct he had told him what those jets were there to determine. Rhea leaned toward the side window, studying the silhouettes with a stillness that unsettled Mara more than any alarm had. "F-15CS, she said. "NATO markings. They're not here to say hello." "What does that mean?" Mara's voice cracked. "It means somewhere behind them is a command authority trying to decide if we're a threat," Rhea said. "No transponder, no radio contact, off course, inside a restricted training corridor. From where they're sitting, we look exactly like an aircraft that's been hijacked or turned hostile." Petrakis's hands went white on the yoke. "They wouldn't. They follow a procedure," Rhea said, cutting him off gently but firmly. "Rock wings, we comply. Flash lights in sequence, we comply. It's called the intercept signal protocol. It exists so nobody has to guess. I need you to trust me on every step of it." Outside, the lead jet rocked its wings once, slow and deliberate. The universal signal that meant follow me or answer right now before this goes somewhere none of us wanted to. At a NATO command post 200 miles east, Colonel Priya Sethna stared at a radar return that refused to make sense. "Talk to me," she said to the young controller beside her. "Unidentified contact, transponder dark, off its filed track by 31 miles, radio silent for 6 minutes. 2 Eagles are on it now, visual confirmed, wide-body commercial silhouette. Could be equipment failure. Could be..." The controller agreed. Could also be exactly what the protocol exists for. Sethna felt the particular cold weight of a decision she'd trained for and never wanted to make. Time to corridor boundary. 4 minutes at current track. For minutes. For minutes to determine whether a wide body full of civilians was a storm-battered airliner fighting for its life or something else entirely. "Give me Anvil 1," she said. In the lead F-15, Major Devin Ash, call sign Anvil, held formation off the 787's wing, watching for any response to his wing rock. None came for 11 long seconds. His voice, when it finally crackled through to Sethna's command post, was carefully neutral, trained to be. "Command, Anvil 1. No response to visual signal. Aircraft is stable, appears to be flying manually, no erratic maneuvering. Recommend holding before escalation." "Copy, Anvil 1. You have 90 more seconds before I need a recommendation with teeth." Ash exhaled once slow, behind his mask, and eased his jet a fraction closer to the airliner's wingtip, close enough that anyone looking out that cockpit window would see his face. He didn't expect what looked back at him. Rhea saw the fighter's canopy tilt, the pilot's helmeted head turning toward them, and she understood immediately what was about to happen next. "They're going to want a visual response," she said. "Owen, flash your landing lights. 3 short, 1 long." It's an old signal, but it's in the book, and any fighter pilot trained in the last 30 years will recognize it as understood, complying, non-hostile. Petrakis's hand found the switch with a steadiness that surprised him. 3 short flashes, 1 long. The lead F-15 held position, unmoving, its pilot clearly reading the signal, clearly hesitating. "That should buy us time," Rhea said. "Not trust. Time." Mara, still gripping her yoke though Petrakis had the controls, finally asked the question that had been building since the woman walked in. "How do you know all this?" "This isn't standard airline training. Because I used to be the one flying that jet," Rhea said, without a trace of boast in it. "I've held that same wing position off aircraft that didn't know if I was there to help or to shoot. I know exactly what's going through that man's head right now." Outside, Anvil 1's voice crackled over an emergency guard frequency Petrakis hadn't realized was still functioning. "Unidentified aircraft. This is a NATO intercept flight. Squawk 7700 if you are declaring an emergency. Acknowledge." Petrakis fumbled at the transponder panel with hands that had gone unsteady again. "It's not. The whole system's degraded. I don't know if this will even transmit." Rhea's hand closed over his on the panel, calm and sure. "It will. Trust the hardware. It's the software that lied to you tonight." The transponder blinked once, twice, and then held a steady code, 7700. "Emergency declared." In Anvil 1's cockpit, Devin Ash watched the code populate on his own display and felt some of the tension drain from his shoulders. Not all of it, but enough. "Command, Anvil 1. Aircraft is now squawking emergency. Looks like an electrical fault, not hostile intent. Recommend continued escort. No further escalation." Sethna's voice was tight, with the residue of a decision she was glad she hadn't had to make. "Copy. Stay on their wing, Anvil 1. Give me anything else you can on their status." In the 787's cabin, the immediate danger of being mistaken for something worse had passed, but the storm hadn't. The aircraft bucked hard again as it clipped the edge of second cell forming beside the first, and overhead bins rattled open, spilling bags into the aisle. Jolene Ruiz braced against the seatback, calling out reassurances that were beginning to sound thin even to her. The toddler near the galley had stopped crying and gone eerily quiet, clinging to his mother. The businessman had abandoned his slides entirely and sat gripping both armrests, eyes shut, lips moving. Back in the cockpit, Petrakis wiped sweat from his brow with the back of one hand, not daring to release the yoke. "We're squawking. We've got an escort. Are we out of the woods?" Rhea studied the radar returns. The storm cell's edge still lit up ahead of them in furious reds and yellows, and shook her head once. "No, we've solved who we are to them. We haven't solved how we're getting this aircraft on the ground." Behind her, the cockpit door opened, and Jolene Ruiz's face told her the cabin situation had just gotten worse too. "We have a passenger down," Jolene said, breathless. Older man, chest pain, maybe cardiac. We need to land, now, not eventually. Petrakis's face went gray. Landing meant choices, and every choice in front of him was bad. Divert to the nearest coastal strip, and risk flying through the worst of the cell to reach it. Continue toward Lisbon, still 90 minutes out, and hope the man survived the wait. Ditch a partially blind aircraft into open ocean at night, which no one in that cockpit was willing to say aloud. Ria's mind moved the way it had moved 100 times before, over 100 worse landscapes. Where's the nearest strip long enough for this airframe? Mara, hands shaking, pulled up the chart. There's a joint-use base, Thornfield. Military and limited civilian ops. 62 miles northeast. Long enough runway, but it's inside the same restricted corridor those fighters came out of. Then that's exactly where we're going, Rias said. And that escort out there just became the reason we make it. She reached for the radio herself now, keying it with the practiced economy of someone who'd done this under far worse conditions. Anvil 1, this is the aircraft you're escorting. We have a medical emergency aboard and degraded systems. Requesting priority vector to Thornfield and any support your command can arrange on the ground. There was a pause. The particular pause of a fighter pilot hearing something in a stranger's voice that didn't match a civilian pilot's cadence at all. Copy that. Aerolumen, Ash said slowly. Ma'am, who exactly is speaking? Ria almost smiled despite everything. Later, Anvil 1, fly your wing. 62 miles at a ground speed eroded by headwinds and a still shuddering airframe meant roughly 22 minutes to Thornfield. 22 minutes that felt, to everyone aboard, like the longest stretch of sky any of them had ever crossed. In the cabin, a young ER nurse traveling for a conference had reached the stricken passenger first, calling out vitals to Jolene Ruiz in the clipped, controlled voice of someone trying not to let her own fear show. The businessman, oddly, had become useful, holding in 4-bag improvised from the medical kit, steady hands compensating for a mind that had simply decided panic wasn't an option anymore. On the flight deck, Ria walked Petrakis through a manual approach checklist that hadn't been briefed for this airframe in years, translating fighter pilot economy into airline cockpit language without missing a beat. You're going to fly this the way you did before automation existed. Trust your hands. The jet still knows how to fly. It's just waiting for you to remember you do too. Mara, working the radios under Ria's direction, finally asked the question that had been eating at her since Row 8A had walked through that door. Why didn't you say anything? All this time, you just sat back there like anyone else. Because for 18 months, I have been anyone else, Ria said, eyes on the instruments, voice even. That was the whole point of retiring. Outside, Anvil 1 held tight formation off their wing, a silent, solid presence against the churning dark, while behind him, Colonel Sethna's command post scrambled ground crews, a medical team, and runway lighting at Thornfield. For an aircraft that, as far as anyone on the ground yet knew, was simply an airliner in distress. They had no idea yet who was actually flying it. At Thornfield, Colonel Priya Sethna stood in the command center watching a blip crawl steadily toward her airspace and felt the particular strain of running 2 crises through one radio frequency. Runway 14 is clear, foam trucks standing by, medical team staged, her ops officer reported. ETA, 14 minutes. And the electrical situation? Unknown extent. They've got emergency power, backup hydraulics, no radar transponder redundancy. If they lose the backup systems on approach, they're flying that thing on raw instinct. Sethna keyed her mic to Anvil 1. Devin, what's your read on the flight deck? You said something felt off about that transmission. Ash's voice came back thoughtful, careful. Command, whoever keyed, that radio wasn't reading from a checklist. She spoke like aircrew. Fighter aircrew, specifically. I've heard that cadence in a briefing room, not an airline cabin. Sethna frowned at her display. A passenger? That's my guess, ma'am. It was an unusual thing to flag, and yet something about it settled into Sethna's mind and stayed there. The possibility that somewhere aboard that struggling aircraft was someone who understood exactly what these next 14 minutes required, better than most people alive. Back aboard Flight 812, The storm had begun, finally, to loosen its grip, the worst of the cell sliding behind them into the dark. But the damage was done, hydraulics running on backup power with an unknown margin left, a cardiac patient stabilizing but fragile, and an approach ahead that would need to be flown by hand, at night, onto a runway none of the 3 people in that cockpit had ever landed on before. Rhea checked the fuel gauge, the hydraulic pressure, the weather ahead, and allowed herself exactly one breath of doubt before locking it away. "Talk me through the approach," Petrakis said, voice hoarse, hands aching from 20 minutes of fighting a yoke that fought back. Thornefield's runway 14, 2.4 miles of concrete. No glide slope guidance since their instrument landing system won't sync with our degraded avionics, Rhea said, pulling up what data they had. "You're going to fly this visually, on the numbers, the way pilots did before half this cockpit existed. I'll call your airspeed and altitude. Mara runs the radios and the checklist. Nobody freelances." "Understood, understood," Mara said. And for the first time since the strike, her voice held steady. Rhea kept her eyes moving. Instruments, window, instruments again, the same rhythm she'd use 100 times lining up a battle-damaged jet on a strip too short and too far from home. 1,500 feet. Airspeed's good. Gears down, 3 green. That's the one system tonight that didn't lie to us. Petrakis huffed, something close to a laugh, thin and exhausted. Outside, Anvil 1 peeled off from close formation, sliding out ahead to guide them visually toward runway lights, just now blinking into view through breaking cloud. 2 rows of white, bracketed by the flashing red and blue of ground vehicles staged along the tarmac. "Runway in sight," Petrakis said. "Then fly it like you've done it 1,000 times, Rhea said. "Because after tonight, you will have." In the cabin, Jolene Ruiz moved down the aisle one last time, voice pitch calm over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final approach. Please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened." Nobody needed telling twice. Every passenger aboard had felt, in their bones, that the next 4 minutes would decide everything. At 800 feet, the backup hydraulic system chose that exact moment to stutter. A tone sounded, sharp and unfamiliar, and the yoke went momentarily loose in Petrakis's hands before resistance returned, thinner than before. "I'm losing pressure," he said, teeth gritted. "Just a little. But it's happening." Rhea's eyes snapped to the gauge. "Secondary reservoirs holding for now. You have maybe 90 seconds of margin before we need a plan B. And there is no plan B at 800 feet, so we are not going to need one. Reduce your control inputs, smaller corrections. Let the aircraft settle itself between them. If we lose it entirely, we won't," Rhea said, and something in her voice, not false confidence, but the specific certainty of someone who had run this exact kind of math under fire before, steadied him more than any gauge could. 500 feet. You're on center line. Airspeed's a hair fast. Ease it back 2 knots. Mara, radio in hand, kept Thornfield Tower updated in short, controlled bursts. Her earlier panic burned away into something closer to focus. Below them, the runway lights sharpened from a blur into 2 crisp lines racing up to meet the aircraft. 200 feet, Rhea said. "Flare when I say." "Not before." The cabin held its breath as one. The businessman's hand locked with the ER nurses without either of them noticing they'd reached for a stranger. The cardiac patient, stabilized now, lay with his eyes closed, unaware how close the last 4 minutes had come to being far worse. "Now," Rhea said. Petrakis flared, and the main gear touched Thornefield's runway with a jolt, a screech, and, after 22 minutes that had felt like a lifetime, the solid, blessed certainty of concrete. The aircraft rolled to a stop on Thornefield's runway 14 at 7:31 p.m., surrounded within seconds by flashing emergency lights and the low growl of ground vehicles converging from every direction. Inside the cockpit, nobody moved for 3 full seconds. Then Petrakis exhaled a breath he felt he'd been holding for 20 minutes straight and looked over at the woman who'd walked in as a stranger and left as, unmistakably, the reason they were all still alive. "Colonel Calder," he said slowly, "I think you saved this aircraft." "You flew it," Rhea said. I just reminded you that you could. Outside on the tarmac, Major Devin Ash brought his F-15 around for a final low pass before breaking off toward the base's flight line, then climbed down from his own cockpit 40 minutes later to find himself walking, by coincidence of timing, toward the same medical tent where the cardiac patient was being loaded into an ambulance, and past the open aircraft door, where a woman in civilian clothes stood speaking quietly with ground crew, a retired officer's bearing evident in every line of her posture, even without a uniform. Ash stopped mid-stride. Something about her stance, the flat economy of her gestures, the way she scanned a scene the way pilots scan instrument panels, snagged at a memory he couldn't immediately place. Then Colonel Sethna arrived at a half-jog from the command building, breathless, and stopped dead 6 feet from Rhea Calder, her expression shifting from professional urgency into something closer to disbelief. "Widow," Sethna said, the old call sign escaping her before rank or protocol could stop it. "It's actually you." Every head within earshot turned. For a moment, Rhea said nothing, and the silence stretched long enough that Mara, standing nearby wrapped in a foil emergency blanket, felt the ground shift beneath a story she thought she'd already understood. "Priya," Rhea finally said, and something in her voice warmed for the first time all night. "It's been a long time. You two know each other?" Petrakis asked. Sethna's laugh came out disbelieving, almost giddy with relief. "Know each other? Captain, this woman trained half my squadron. She flew lead on missions I'm not clear to fully describe. In an airframe most of your passengers have only seen in documentaries. When I was a green lieutenant terrified of my first night intercept, Colonel Calder was the one who talked me through it on a dark runway, not unlike this one." Devin Ash, standing a few feet off, finally placed the memory that had been nagging at him since Heavey walked past the aircraft door. "Widow. The widow. I read your after-action report in flight school. We used it as a case study." He looked at her with something between awe and disbelief. "You're the reason I fly the way I fly tonight." Rhea's expression stayed level, but something in her shoulders eased, the particular fatigue of a person who has spent 18 months hiding a part of herself finally allowed, for one night, to simply exist in the open. Mara stepped closer, voice quiet. "You could have told us. Any point tonight, you could have said who you were. Would it have made you trust the aircraft any faster?" Rhea asked, not unkindly. "Or would you have spent 30 seconds we didn't have, being impressed instead of listening?" Mara had no answer for that. It was, she realized, entirely fair. Word moved through the airfield faster than any official channel could contain it. A decorated former Strike Eagle pilot, call sign Widow, had walked off a civilian flight after talking 2 exhausted airline pilots through an electrical failure, a medical emergency, and a NATO intercept, all in the same 22 minutes. By the time Rhea reached the small operations building for a debrief, a dozen off-duty personnel had gathered near the doorway, not quite openly staring, though not quite pretending not to either. Devin Ash fell into step beside her. "Ma'am, for what it's worth, that was the calmest cockpit override I've ever heard on an open channel. And I've heard a lot of them." "It wasn't an override," Rhea said. "Petrakis flew that landing. I just reminded him what his hands already knew." "That's not nothing," Ash said. "Most people, under that pressure, forget what they know. Some people never learned it in the first place. You did neither." Inside the ops building, Colonel Sethna waved off a young airman's attempt to formally announce Rhea's arrival. "She doesn't need an introduction here," Sethna said, quiet enough only Rhea heard it. "Some of us never forgot who she was. We just didn't expect to need her again." Rhea allowed herself, finally, a small and genuine smile, the first unguarded expression she'd worn all night. "I didn't expect to be needed either," she said. "Turns out retirement doesn't come with an off switch. Just a very good disguise." Outside on the tarmac, Petrakis stood beside his aircraft, staring up at its lightning-scarred nose, and finally allowed his hands to shake, now that they no longer needed to be steady. The debrief room at Thornfield smelled of stale coffee and adrenaline burning off in real time. Sethna spread a printout of the storm cell's radar track across the table. The anomalous growth rate circled twice in red. "Meteorology's calling this a once-in-a-decade formation," she said. grew 40 knots faster than any model predicted. You didn't fail to see it coming. Captain, nobody could have. Petrakis nodded slowly, some of the guilt he'd been carrying since the first lightning strike finally loosening its grip. Mara sat quietly beside him, turning over the night's events with the particular clarity that comes after fear has fully drained out. I trusted the system over you, she said to Petrakis. Twice tonight. I need to sit with that. You will, Rhea said, not unkindly, from across the table. That's not weakness, Lieutenant. Sorry, First Officer. That's a generation trained to trust machines because the machines are usually right. The problem isn't trusting them. It's forgetting that usually isn't always, and that somebody still has to know what to do on the day it isn't. Sethna looked up from the radar printout. Speaking of which, Anvil 1's intercept call almost escalated to a shoot-down authorization tonight. 90 more seconds of silence, and I'd have had to make a call none of us wanted. The room went quiet. Petrakis paled slightly at how close the margin had actually been. You made the right call holding, Rhea said to Sethna. Every good intercept doctrine exists, so nobody has to guess in the dark. Tonight, it worked exactly the way it was designed to. Outside the window, ground crews were already running diagnostic checks on the aircraft's scarred nose cone, cataloging damage that would ground Flight 812 for repairs, and give everyone aboard an unplanned night at Thornfield to process what had nearly happened. By midnight, the passengers of Flight 812 had been moved into a hastily arranged lounge on base, blankets and coffee, and the particular giddy exhaustion of people who'd survived something they wouldn't fully understand until days later. The cardiac patient, stabilized and resting in the base infirmary, had asked, twice, to shake the hand of the pilot who landed us, and been gently informed there'd actually been 3 pilots working that landing, one of whom hadn't even been rostered for duty. The ER nurse who'd worked alongside the businessman sat with him now over vending machine coffee, the adrenaline of strangers turned allies still humming between them. I don't even know your name, she admitted. Neither did I, apparently, until tonight, he said, and they both laughed the loose, relieved laugh of people who'd been close enough to something terrible to appreciate simply being tired instead. In a quieter corner, Mara found Rhea alone, staring out a window at the aircraft still lit under floodlights on the tarmac, technicians crawling over its damaged nose. Can I ask you something? Mara said. Why give it up? The flying, the rank, all of it. You clearly still have it. Rhea considered the question longer than Mara expected. Because for 22 years, I was needed in places I couldn't tell most people about, doing things I couldn't fully explain even to my own daughter. I wanted just once to be ordinary, boring, anonymous in seat 8A. Tonight sort of ruined that. Rhea's mouth curved, tired and real. Tonight reminded me that being ordinary and being ready aren't opposites. I just forgot for a while that you could be both. Outside, ground crews finished their inspection, and the first quiet estimate came back, 48 hours before the aircraft would fly again. The 48-hour delay gave the base an unusual, almost domestic rhythm. Passengers wandering the small commissary, exchanging phone numbers with strangers they'd bled fear alongside, the ER nurse and the businessman, whose name turned out to be Thomas Everly, discovering they lived 40 minutes apart back home and might improbably stay in touch. Devin Ash sought Rhea out again the next morning, finding her at the edge of the flight line, watching a training squadron run touch and goes in the pale early light. Can I ask you something, ma'am? You already are, Rhea said, not unkindly. Would you ever consider coming back? Even part-time? Training command's always short on instructors who've actually lived what they teach. Rhea watched a young pilot botch a landing flare and correct it, exactly the kind of small mistake she remembered making herself decades ago. I taught simulators for 18 months and told myself it was enough, she said. Last night reminded me it might not be, but it also reminded me why I stepped back in the first place. I don't have an answer for you yet, Major. Ask me again in a month. Ash nodded, satisfied with an honest uncertainty rather than a hollow yes. Fair enough. For what it's worth, Anvil Flight logged your work last night as a training case study. Unofficially, I imagine it'll end up official eventually. Just don't put my name on it. Ria said. Widow retired. Let her stay retired, even in the paperwork. Ash smiled. No promises, Kenneth. Back at the ops building, Sethna was finalizing the incident report that would, in careful and heavily redacted language, describe an extraordinary night, omitting at Ria's quiet request most of the details that would have made a private woman suddenly very public. Some legends preferred to stay unread. 2 days later, Flight 812, repaired, recertified, its nose cone gleaming with fresh paint over the lightning scarring, sat fueled and ready on Thornfield's runway, a new crew standing by to fly the connecting passengers onward, while Petrakis and Mara, both clear but shaken, opted to fly home as passengers themselves before returning to active rotation. The original passengers gathered near the gate in a loose, unspoken reunion. The ER nurse and Thomas Everly sitting together without needing to explain why. Jolene Ruiz hugging each departing traveler like family rather than customers. The cardiac patient walking unassisted onto the tarmac to personally thank a woman he still only knew as the pilot from 8A. Ria shook his hand, warm and brief. Glad you're doing better. They tell me I wouldn't be if you'd stayed asleep, he said. I don't sleep as deep as people think, Ria said, and he laughed, the first easy laugh she'd heard from him since the emergency. Mara approached last, hesitant in a way she hadn't been since the debrief. I looked up your record. Well, I was allowed to find, anyway. It's a lot, Colonel. It's just a career, Ria said gently. One I'm proud of, and one I closed the door on for good reasons. Don't let last night make you distrust the instruments, Mara. Just don't let it make you forget you're allowed to override them when your gut and your training both say something's wrong. I won't, Mara said, and for the first time all week, sounded certain of it. Devin Ash gave Ria a final, respectful nod from across the tarmac. No salute, since she was a civilian now, but something in the gesture carried the weight of one anyway. Ria boarded the replacement aircraft, found seat 8A waiting for her exactly as before, and settled in for the last leg to her daughter's wedding. The wedding, 3 days later, was small and warm and entirely unremarkable in the best possible way. A courtyard in Lisbon strung with lights, a nervous groom, a bride who cried the moment she saw her mother walk in, unaware just how close that arrival had come to not happening at all. Ria danced the first dance with her daughter instead of a husband long since gone, and for those few minutes, she was simply a mother, nothing more, nothing less. Exactly the anonymity she'd been chasing on that flight before the sky had other plans. A week later, back home in Denver, she returned to the simulator building where she taught nervous cadets 3 days a week and found, waiting on her desk, a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, Anvil 1 silhouette off a 787's wing at dusk, and a handwritten note. Command still doesn't know your name when in the official report. Some of us decided you'd earn the choice. Dia, she smiled, folded it away in the same drawer where her old ribbons lived, unseen but not forgotten, and went back to teaching a room full of young pilots who trusted their instruments a little more than they trusted themselves. Mara called once, a month later, just to talk. No crisis, no emergency, just a young first officer checking in with a woman who'd changed how she flew. I second-guess the autopilot now, she admitted. In a good way. I think. That's exactly the right amount, Ria said. Trust it. Just don't worship it. Somewhere over the Atlantic that same week, another flight crossed paths, unremarkably, with a training patrol out of Thornfield. 2 aircraft passing in routine airspace, neither aware of the story written in the sky between them months before. 6 months later, Ria Calder sat in seat 8A again, on another ordinary flight, headed nowhere more dramatic than a conference for retired officers she'd almost skipped. The woman beside her, mid-conversation about nothing important, glanced over as the seatbelt sign chimed for routine turbulence and asked, half joking, "You're not nervous at all, are you?" "Not particularly," Ria said, settling back, eyes closing. She thought, briefly, of a storm over the mid-Atlantic, of 2 fighter jets off a wingtip in the dark, of a captain's hands finally remembering what they already knew. She thought of Mara's voice on the phone, steadier now, and of a photograph folded away in a desk drawer beside ribbons nobody saw anymore. Being ordinary, she'd learned, was never really about hiding. It was about choosing quietly when the world needed the other version of you, and being ready either way. If there's one thing this story is really about, it's this: the quietest person in the room is sometimes the only one who's already lived through your worst day and come out the other side. Competence doesn't need an audience. It just needs to be there when it's called. If this story stayed with you, if some part of you wants to believe the world still has a few Rhea Calders in it, sleeping quietly in row 8, ready without asking to be noticed, tell us in the comments who you think should hear this one next. Share it with someone who needs the reminder, and subscribe because there are more of them out there, and their stories deserve to be told too. Somewhere over open water, engines humming steady, Rhea Calder slept exactly the way she had before it all began.